In this video, I'm going to show you how to improve Capsim metrics and therefore your grades. So in the simulation, you have two decisions deadlines each week. You will be judged based on how well you achieve these 5 metrics that are given here. Contribution margin over 30%, a zero emergency loan, that you'll satisfy at least 95% of your demand. That means that you will, on each segment, if there is a potential bar graph that is brown, you have to satisfy 95% of the market share that bar indicates, and you have to carry less than 90 days of inventory. You must also increase your stock price over the last year, and you have to generate a profit greater than 0. So this presentation is focused on each one and organized around each one of these metrics so that you can know how to improve them. The first thing, you have to increase your contribution margin to get it over 30%. If you need to increase your contribution margin, then you have to first understand what contribution margin is. Contribution margin is what you have left over after you subtract your variable labor and your variable material costs. So that, by reducing these variable labor and variable materials costs, this will improve your contribution margin and hopefully get it up over 30%. Even if your contribution margin is over 30%, you should still be trying to improve it each round so that you can continue to make more profit each round and therefore enjoy a higher stock price, for example. So here are a few ways of increasing your contribution margin. Number one is to increase your price. Now be careful. Some strategies dictate that you have a low price, so you don't want to be giving a slow, clunky, big fat sensor that is charging more than sensors that perform better and are a smaller size. You have to make this decision in the context of your strategy and also your competition. But increasing your price will increase your contribution margin, assuming you can sell all the units at that price. Another one is to invest in TQM programs that reduce labor and material costs. The total quality management is what TQM stands for, and those programs kick in later competition rounds where you can spend a certain amount on different programs. Spending on those programs that reduce labor and material costs will increase your contribution margin. You can increase your sales by increasing the accounts receivable in the marketing decision module. Kind of in the middle bottom of the marketing decision module, you'll find a entry screen where you can extend your accounts receivable beyond 30 days. I wouldn't go way out, but you can go out, like, say, to 60 days, for example. These favorable credit terms will increase your sales and therefore increase your contribution margin. You can also increase your sales by superior positioning, pricing, accessibility, awareness, mean time between failures, age, all those things. If you can hit what the buyer wants consistent with your strategy, then what the simulation seems to do is to give you higher contribution margin, presumably because of economies of scale, meaning that when you're making a lot of something, you end up having lower costs overall. And I'm going to add one more here too, if you want. If it's not important to your customers in a segment, then what you can do is reduce mean time between failures. That refers to the average time between which the product needs repair. What this does is this decreases material costs. So it's like taking something that's made of metal and then making it out of plastic, which is cheaper. It won't last as long, but it'll use less materials. So you can actually, through R&D, make your product less reliable if reliability is not important to the customers in that segment. Okay, that's the contribution margin. Now, how do we avoid emergency loans? Well, accurate sales forecasting is absolutely critical. I keep saying that the most important decision you'll make in Capsim is your sales forecast. Most emergency loans are due to overly optimistic forecasting. Students believe that if they can make their pro forma income statement look good by putting in a really high sales forecast, then everything will work out fine when the competition round processes. That's a false assumption, because the decision you make interacts with other teams' decisions, And the amount that you can sell is not unlimited. It's constrained by the customer survey scores of other teams who might be better than yours. So just making your pro formas look good through really optimistic forecasting can lead you into a position where you make all this inventory and then you can't sell it. And that leads to carrying costs because you can't sell all that excess inventory. So you should use this formula, which is in order to estimate your forecast, and that is your segment demand last round times 1 plus the segment growth rate times your estimated market share next round. This one right here, I suggest you go to page 10 of the Capstone Courier and use the potential market share for all segments in which you plan to make sales next round, and use that as your best guess as to what your market share will be next round. Later I'll provide you with some reasons why you might want to go higher than your potential market share, but for now, for this purpose, at least at a minimum, you should use the potential market share found on page 10 of the Capstone Courier for this highly important judgmental type of metric used in this formula. Another reason that people take emergency loans is inadequate financing. What this means is that you spend money on research and development, later on TQM programs, accessibility, awareness, etc. That capacity, perhaps, all that takes money. And if you can't generate enough money from your operations in order to pay for those things, then what you need to do is you need to raise money from stock or debt issues to create a cash reserve of 5 to 10% of your sales. So after all of your other non-finance decisions are made, what you should do is you should go into the pro formas, look at your income statement, and see what your sales is. Try to raise as much stock and debt as you need in order to have a cash reserve at the bottom of your financing decision screen in Capsim, so that you can weather any storms in case you end up with a lot of unsold inventory in spite of your best efforts. That reserve will prevent you from taking an emergency loan. Now, when you raise your money in order to have a nice cash cushion at the end of your decision making in the finance section, use the financing section of the Capsim 6 strategies document for the strategy you're following. Use that as your guide as to whether to use stock financing or equity financing or debt financing in order to achieve your cash reserve. Now, one thing though, it's possible, and this has happened with teams, that they drive their stock price down to like $1, for example, because they generate an emergency loan and losses. If that's not a good time when your stock price is low to use stock in order to issue stock in order to fund your reserve. In that situation, you should probably use debt instead of stock, because if you raise a lot of equity financing when your stock price is low, that means you're creating a lot of shareholders who are expecting a return, and that means you've got to share whatever profits you make in the future with a large number of people, and that means less per shareholder, and that means a lower stock price. So avoid using stock to raise money if your stock price is low. Use debt instead, and that's regardless of what your strategy says. Okay, the next one: how do you satisfy demand and avoid excess inventory? Well, the key to satisfying 95% of demand is, again, to forecast well. I keep saying forecasting is your most important decision that you'll probably make in this simulation. In the formula, again, one thing you can do as I said in the previous one, to satisfy 95% of your demand is to use this formula. And for your estimated market share next round, use your potential market share from page 10 of the Capstone Courier. Well, you can go higher than your potential market share if you feel you can justify it. For example, if you've made a lot of R&D and marketing decisions that you think are going to make your product have a higher customer survey score than your competitors, that might justify a slightly higher estimated market share in your sales forecast. Another thing you can do is you can look for opportunities in the segment. For example, look at this diagram right here below. The brown crimson bar here represents potential market share, how much the company deserves to sell based on the level of its customer survey score. The yellow bars here represent how much they actually sold after the decision round processed. And you can see that Ferris and Andrews in this segment are having trouble forecasting. They could have had a market share of 29%, but they only ended up with a market share of less than 15% just because they didn't forecast high enough and therefore didn't produce enough to satisfy demand. So you want now all these other groups, Baldwin, Chester, Digby, and Erie, would all have gotten stars because not only did they satisfy 100% of their potential market share or potential demand, they satisfied customers who left Ferris and Andrews because they couldn't get what they needed from those two companies. These other teams produced more than their potential and therefore captured all that excess demand that Ferris and Andrews couldn't satisfy. So if you see in your segment that there are a lot of companies that are having trouble satisfying and forecasting well and therefore are leaving money on the table, that might be an excuse for you to increase your estimated market share beyond your potential market share last round. So you have to justify it. Increase it when you notice a lot of companies are having problems meeting their potential share. But be careful, don't overdo it, because you don't want to have more than 90 days of inventory on hand. So be conservative in terms of that increase from your potential market share last round for this figure right here in the forecast. But you can go over your potential market share if you believe you can justify it for these reasons. Okay, now the next one. How do you increase your stock price? Well, number one, have strong cash from operating activities. That's the number one way to improve your stock price. And you can see your cash from operating activities on page 14 of the Capstone Courier. Another thing you can do, which will cause a modest, like a small increase in your stock price, is to pay a dividend. But you have to make sure that the dividend is not more than your earnings per share. Earnings per share is the net profit divided by the number of shares outstanding, and it's actually calculated for you on page 2 of the Courier. So if you do decide to pay a dividend, make sure that it's not more than your earnings per share. If you had a negative earnings per share, you shouldn't pay a dividend at all, because that'll only hurt your stock price further. The other way to increase your stock price is that when you have the money, usually a little bit later in the simulation, after a few rounds have gone by and you've been dominating the market or you've been generating good cash flow from operations, when funds allow, buy back stock. So what that means is you make an offer to all of your shareholders who have stock. You say, we'd like to buy this back at this price, so you get a bit of a return on it. And then what that means is you have fewer shares outstanding, meaning that you have fewer mouths to feed when you generate an operating profit. By mouths to feed, I mean you don't have as many people demanding to get a share of those finite profits that you're generating. So buy back stock to increase your stock price. Now, to generate a profit greater than zero, which is the last metric that you receive grades for, if you're doing all the previous advice in this presentation well, profit should take care of itself. Make sure you forecast accurately and use judgment on the estimated market share component of the formula. Price products at the maximum your strategy allows. So this means if you're a niche cost leader, that maximum that you're willing to charge for your price is going to be influenced how you compare to your competition, because you want to be the low cost leader, right? But if you are following a differentiator strategy, and there's different niche, broad, and life cycle differentiator strategies. If you're following differentiator strategy, you should try to price your products as close to the maximum as possible while allowing for the effective competition. Increase your contribution margin and invest in total quality management programs that reduce material, labor, and period costs. So these are a few things you can do in order to increase these metrics on which you are judged upon and which attract a grade for your decisions that you make in the competition rounds.